surprised me was that you can still walk into a hardware store and buy a jug of Roundup here in Canada, in the United States, anywhere, even after all of this. And when you look at the label doesn't say that you have to do anything specific. It doesn't say that you should wear gloves, that you shouldn't eat while you're doing it. It says it's safe for humans and pets. It only targets plants. And there was one of the trials with Alberta and Alva Pilias, in fact, who, they asked her, what were you doing spraying in your flip-flops and your shorts? And then the lawyers showed a Roundup ad, which had a guy in his shorts spraying with the dog running around him, etc. And so if that's the way that these things are marketed, of course people are going to believe it's safe when you tell them it's safe.
You've probably heard of the word glyphosate, but can you say it and can you spell it? I know it took me a long time to be able to enunciate glyphosate because it's a mouthful and I sometimes still trip over it. What we're learning today, though, is that glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide worldwide, and it is wreaking havoc on our biodiversity of the soil and the biodiversity and health of our gut. And it's also being connected to Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer. Countries around the world have banned the use of glyphosate because they're seeing the impact that it makes on human health and on environmental health. Yet there's certain countries like Canada and the United States that is still deciding to use it. Jennifer Baichwal is a tenacious, curious, and provocative documentary filmmaker who has given us a gift. Her and her team released their newest documentary, Into the Weeds, earlier in 2022. It documents the Dewayne Lee Johnson trial and the release of the Monsanto papers. And they have done an extraordinary job of helping us understand the impact of glyphosate. They pull back the curtains to help us see what is happening at a government level and corporate level to keep us in the dark and to discredit what people are experiencing as a result of using glyphosate. And it is alarming. And I highly encourage you to watch the documentary Into the Weeds, read up about as much as you can about glyphosate so you can educate yourself and have conversation with your friends and family who are using glyphosate. And I invite you to listen to this conversation with Jennifer, where she shares why she chose to do this documentary, what surprised her the most in creating and filming and putting together Into the Weeds, and what gives her the most hope moving forward, and what we can do to make a difference and to mitigate the use of glyphosate and chemicals worldwide and right in your own communities. If you haven't subscribed to Heart and Soil yet, I invite you to hop on over to heartandsoilmagazine.com and grab yourself a subscription and join our community. It is a place where we amplify regenerative farming, gardening, and living for your health and for planetary health. We interview and feature experts and scientists, leaders, farmers, and gardeners from around the world. It's an amazing community, and we would love to have you join us. Thanks for tuning into this conversation. We really appreciate and value your time. Enjoy the conversation and make yourself an amazing day. Jen, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your newest fabulous documentary, Into the Weeds.
Thank you for having me.
I have goosebumps having this conversation with you because, as you know, my dad recently spoke on the panel at one of your screenings in Vancouver, BC for Into the Weeds. And he has been deeply impassioned about glyphosate for over a decade, probably I could say decades, and just chomping at the bit that nobody has been talking about it and bringing the awareness to it that he felt it needed to have. And so when I saw the Into the Weeds documentary come out, I was really curious about the way you're going to share the story. And before we get into that, I'm curious though, like what was it about this story and glyphosate that made you decide to take a deep dive into this and to bring the story into the light?
Well, it started with Anthropocene, the Human Epoch, which is what our last film, which was a 5-year project really, and it involved a film, a feature documentary, a museum exhibition, 2 books, an educational program, and it really followed these scientists that formed the Anthropocene working group, geologists and other scientists who were investigating whether we were in a different geological era or epoch because of human impact on the earth. And they are proposing that we are no longer in the Holocene geological epoch, that we are in the Anthropocene geological epoch, because humans now change the systems of the earth more than all natural processes combined. And when that film was being premiered at Sundance, we asked an old friend through Waterkeeper and Swim Drink Fish Canada that Nick and I have been involved with for years. Nick, my husband, who is the producer and cinematographer and often co-director on our work. So, and we asked Bobby Kennedy, who is someone who we've known for many years because of his environmental and advocacy work, if he would come and introduce the film and sort of be part of that. And it was incredible, and he was amazing. And basically, when I asked him what he was working on, he said, "I'm working on these Roundup trials." And I said, "Who is documenting that?" And he said, "Nobody is documenting that." And then I just thought, oh dear, like somebody has to document that and document it properly, like as an historical record of a moment in time where like a true David versus Goliath story, and B, a record of corporate malfeasance and all of the things that go along with. It was right at the end of a very busy period for us, and Nick was understandably a bit spooked about taking on a company like Monsanto, now Bayer. They're notoriously aggressive and litigious, and yet I just thought it had to be done. And so Bobby introduced us to the lead lawyers. It was a consortium of lawyers that took this on. You can imagine the cost and the expense and the research that has to be done to even mount one of these trials, right? And so it's part of something called mass tort, which is, it has its limitations as a tool for justice because it's limited to money damages only. So it's not like the chief executives are going to jail. They're just paying a lot of money, and they seem to have a lot of money, so it doesn't really stop the business as usual model. But I've been given our environmental film work and interest. Both of us have been environmentalists for many years. We've known about Monsanto in its various iterations of from DDT to onward, Agent Orange, Rachel Carson, etc. And so GMO. And so we thought that this would be a worthwhile thing to do. That's how it started. And once we met all those lawyers and they agreed that we could tell their story, it became very important for me to all of our films in some way include a dialectic of scale and detail, and it became really important to find someone who we could identify with, who told his story. And the first moment I met Lee, I knew that he was one. And he was a bit reluctant at first. Like, as I've said, he's a guy who keeps a low profile. That he didn't want to be the poster child for this, but he ended up becoming that and embracing it because of the possibilities of what he could do, and his trust when he agreed to be part of it and to be featured and to be as intimate as he was, which was his idea in many cases, because he really wanted people to know how hard his life is, that's what really cemented things for me. So that's how it all started.
Wow. I have both goosebumps and tears because when you share a story like this, it's uh, I mean, it's paramount to go up about against these big companies and against the ideology of what we're being told and what the deeper truth might be. And then there's also this tenderness and vulnerability around the hearts of, like you said, the characters, and in this case, Lee, of him really sharing a part of his journey, and how do you actually bring that into the light, and not make it all doom and gloom, and at the same time keep it real and create hope. And I think you did that really beautifully in the documentary. I really do. I think there's a lot of risk in doing a documentary like this because of we were just talking about the science-based facts going into a trial like this had a lot of weight, and there's a lot of vulnerability around the efficacy, I guess you could say, of what's real and not real, both for the trial and also for the person who's experiencing the cancer in this case. So I'm wondering, how did you dance with that in the creation of the
Well,
documentary?
I mean, when I talk about scale and detail, it sounds a bit abstract, but it's really about the personal and the universal, the bigger picture. And so we really wanted to investigate what the ubiquity of use. I mean, everybody knows that glyphosate is the world's most widely used herbicide. And so because of that, it deserves to be scrutinized, perhaps even more than anything else, right?
Right. But here's the thing though, Jennifer, not everybody knows that. Like, we think everybody knows that, and maybe everybody in the know knows that. A lot of farmers who use it can't even pronunciate though the word, right? And people are like, oh, they don't even know what the active ingredient is and that they're using half the time. And so
I know. And of course that is a very part of a very clever strategy on the part of the company that it's safe enough to drink. That was one of we heard that numerous times from farmers and other people who used it in industrial applications. And then in the ordinary people who just used it in their backyards. And of course, it was thinking about the question of, why lawns? What's a weed as opposed to a plant? Like, these are things that these judgments we make, that when you step back from them, you kind of say to yourself, what system allows that kind of thing? But I suppose we really wanted to illustrate that ubiquity of use. So that hence all the stats, etc. But and then what the potential and real effects are of that. And of course, biodiversity loss is endemic. It's everywhere, and global insect collapse was one thing that we were really focusing on. And in fact, the whole film was a secret until about a month before its release. We told everyone that we were making a film on global insect collapse, and all of our funders also maintained that, because we didn't want to be harassed during the making. And so it was really only at the end that people learned that it was about this specific chemical. But in addition to that bigger picture question, there had to be personal stories. And Lee was, as I said, the trust and the relationship between a documentarian and their subject is a very complex one. And I've been doing this for nearly 30 years now, and I've thought about it a lot. And it's, to me, the ethics of engagement are the most important part of what we do as filmmakers. And if it were not the most important part of what we do, it would not be successful. Not only would it be morally wrong, it would not be successful. And so you have to have an authentic relationship And
Mhm.
Lee, there are some very, difficult to watch scenes in the film. And those were Lee's choice. He wanted people to see just how hard it was for him to get up.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that story, and the story of the impact on one family, his beautiful wife Araceli, his two children, and just the fact that this could happen to anyone. And then you have all these other plaintiffs who come in occasionally to talk about their own experience. Again, people just like both of us. And so that was extremely important to me to find that balance. But the most difficult part of the film was this making a film like this requires an enormous amount of oversight, fact checking, etc. And there's something in film called errors and omissions insurance, which you have to get for anything that gets shown in the world on a television station and film festivals, because if you don't get that insurance and somebody decides to sue you, then everybody down the line can be at risk. And so you get these lawyers who specialize in that to comb through the film, literally, to determine if everything that is stated in the film is backed up. So there can be no kind of loose claims, right? So to make sure of that, and that's why I am absolutely stand behind every single claim that is made in the film, because it was triple checked, and it was checked by us, and it was checked by them. The other part of that is making science, quite complex science, comprehensible to ordinary people, including myself. That was really complicated. So we had to take what was used in the trials. We had to figure out ways to use animation and graphics to illustrate it in a way that everybody could get. And I think that was hugely important to make known the effect, like what are the effects and how do we find out what these effects are. And so I would say that the combination of the legal element, the science element, and then also just these heartbreaking stories of plaintiffs and Lee's bravery, as well as the bigger picture of what pesticide use does to the earth and all other species, us, but everything else too. We were trying to get all of that together.
Did you, going into this, did you know the impact of the pesticide use? Like, did you really get it or understand it, or were you just kind of like heard about it? Like, what was your understanding?
Well, we've always known that it is, because of its wide use, that it's one of those systemic things that almost everybody has traces of it in their body somewhere, right? So it's very difficult to have a control group that does not, and the control groups who might not, perhaps Inuit living in the far north, their lifestyles are so different from ours that it wouldn't work anyway as a control group. So it becomes this thing of how do you tell what it's doing when it's everywhere? But we did know that when it began to be used widely as a desiccant, and of course it was promoted as a desiccant because it was supposed to be safe enough to drink, and that when it started to be sprayed directly on crops before harvest to dry them out evenly, the residue levels started to increase in food. And then at the same time, we did a lot of research, and this was something that we couldn't put in the film because it wasn't quite at the level of what they call Daubert, this level of everything has to be, the research has to be at a certain level before it can be admitted in court. But the spike in celiac disease, Crohn's, irritable bowel, etc., that happened at around the same time that it was being really promoted and started to be used widely as a desiccant. And that's also interesting because the latest research that is being done now is really showing incredible effects on the microbiome, and that's not just our microbiome. That's the microbiome of soil, of insects, of birds, of animals, and plants. And so we did know about that, but I've learned so much more as this journey has continued. And we've been continuing to do research with some of the scientists who are still working on these studies, because we have an impact campaign that is intended to really try to very specifically these inflection points in regulatory reviews target the film's use to scrutinize those regulatory reviews. And that's happening in Canada and the US and in the EU. So we're trying to use the film in those contexts.
That's really exciting. What surprised you the most?
I think what surprised me was that you can still walk into a hardware store and buy a jug of Roundup here in Canada, in the United States, anywhere, even after all of this. And when you look at the label doesn't say that you have to do anything specific. It doesn't say that you should wear gloves, that you shouldn't eat while you're doing it. It says it's safe for humans and pets. It only targets plants. And there was one of the trials with Alberta and Alva Pilias, in fact, who, they asked her, what were you doing spraying in your flip-flops and your shorts? And then the lawyers showed a Roundup ad, which had a guy in his shorts spraying with the dog running around him, etc. And so if that's the way that these things are marketed, of course people are going to believe it's safe when you tell them it's safe. I will say that the other thing that really surprised me was the level of corporate malfeasance that can occur. There's these different larger concepts that we try to explore in the film, which are the limitations of mass torts as a tool for justice, the problems of agency capture, where the agencies that are meant to protect us, agency capture is a real problem globally. And what it means is that agencies such as the EPA, or in our case, the PMRA, the Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency, that are meant to protect people from corporate interests, and in this case, chemicals, they often end up sort of serving the corporations that they are meant to police rather than policing them. And that happens in a number of ways. They sometimes call it a revolving door, where people go work for the regulatory agency, then they go work for industry, then they go back. And obviously that's a conflict of interest that is intolerable. To try to sort of tackle how that happens and how you can give these regulatory agencies the teeth that they require to really do their job is very difficult, because it's about money. And they don't have the resources to do these tests on their own. These tests, 2-year studies, cost millions of dollars. So they rely on industry studies, which again is a conflict of interest. So agency capture is one thing. The limitations of mass torts is a tool for justice, because it's only about money. And then also the extent of corporate malfeasance. So during the discovery phase of this trial, which is the research phase, when hundreds of thousands of documents were dumped on the lawyers, and in the old days that would look like an airplane hangar with 2 sets of lawyers with the banker's boxes going through paper. Now it gets fed into a supercomputer, and it's this artificial intelligence that actually was instrumental in finding the extent of the malfeasance. And so what is now called the Monsanto Papers, and there's an excellent book by Carrie Gillam that follows the whole release of those papers. And her earlier book, Whitewash, really gives you a history of how Monsanto began to dominate agriculture. But in any case, that AI showed ghostwriting of papers, intimidation of independent scientists and journalists, collusion with government agencies, et cetera. And that was absolutely shocking to me. I remember Bobby once saying, how these people go to a ball game and then go home and have dinner with their families, the heads of these corporations, and how do they do it? It's a kind of cognitive dissonance. And they're still claiming that they don't believe it's carcinogenic, and they haven't changed the label yet. So that's where we are.
Man, that's surprising. It's shocking and it's alarming, and it does actually leave me speechless, because one of the conversations that comes up often is the disbelief that if something is not safe, if something is not safe for us, it's hard to understand and believe that governments and corporations would allow it. Like, that's a really hard connection for people to make. So, because when that crumbles, their whole paradigm crumbles.
Absolutely. I mean, it's also that it's also that there's something which you probably know already called the precautionary principle, which is a method of research that wants to do the research in advance to determine whether something is dangerous, and if it's dangerous, you don't use it. But that's not how. And this also connects to mass torts, which is that you basically are allowed to use anything with impunity, with very minimal testing, and it's on the onus of the users. If somebody is injured from that, then they have to mount a case or a challenge, and then that challenge is what eventually restricts or regulates that chemical or drug or whatever. And it's just the wrong way around. And I don't think that's just in the United States. I think it's in Canada. I think it's in Europe. I think it's all over. And I think that the countries like the United States that really pressure countries like Mexico that have just tried to ban glyphosate because they don't want their markets interfered with. And so you have that kind of pressure happening too.
So what can we do? What can we do as citizens and as farmers to mitigate the use of chemicals like glyphosate and to help change policy?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because we're in the middle of this impact campaign that is really trying to influence those regulatory moments. And I think there's there's a number of approaches, but two that stand out to me are, as ordinary citizens, the way that we advocate and agitate for change is by holding governments to account. So we have just tabled a parliamentary petition that is going to be presented by Jenica Atwin. We were expecting, 2,500 signatures. We got 18,000 signatures. And that is going to be presented in Parliament, but just the very fact of that petition is in itself I would say, an impetus to these government agencies to look at and these ministers and ministries to look at why people are concerned. So that's one thing. In terms of personal experience, when I said before, why lawns? What is a weed? I think we all have to be thinking more like the indigenous peoples of the world think, which is that we are part of the interconnected web of biodiversity. We are not above it, and we have to live within it and protect it as much as possible. And if that means not having a pristine lawn, by God, who cares about a pristine lawn? So that's one element. In our everyday lives, there's always things that we can do. And of course, the first thing is to just eliminate all chemicals we don't need chemicals to keep things clean or to keep weeds away. The other part of that for farming, and this is a bigger problem because many farmers will argue that, if they can't use glyphosate anymore, the chemicals they will have to use will be worse. And when you look at the regenerative or biodynamic model of farming, which really uses the systems of the earth and the systems of applications, etc., to do that work in a totally sustainable way, we have to kind of overhaul our whole agricultural system and the system of industrial agriculture, subsidies, etc. The big crops that we grow because they're cash crops instead of polyculture farming, etc. That's a bigger problem and a bigger question. But there are also things like aerial spraying of forest plantation. Not that, first of all, these are often on unceded territories of different First Nations groups. Secondly, when you're aerial spraying a whole forest, the effect on the biodiversity is absolutely devastating. And it's only to get rid of the broadleaf species so that they don't compete with the spruce and the pine for light when they're small. And yet it has this absolutely, it's like what do people say, cutting butter with a sledgehammer and or a chainsaw. And it's just not the way. You can send sheep in there. You can, in wine growth, we've been following these biodynamic wine growers who have horses come in between the rows instead of spraying them to keep the weeds up. So there are all kinds of things that we can do. But I think things like petitions, things like joining protests, things like writing to your MPs, being politically involved, voting for parties that have the earth's and people's interests at heart, rather than short-term cynical promises. These are all things we can do.
Mm-hmm. What gives you the most hope in this space of what you're working on right now?
Well, what gives me hope is that in this impact campaign, we have met so many people like you and people who are tirelessly working for this kind of change. And that is incredibly uplifting. But we're also meeting people like Lee who have taken something on, a quiet family person. As you said, I'm a family man. I don't like, I don't like to be in the spotlight, but that's exactly what he's doing for the greater good, not for his own fame in any way. And that there's something unbelievably inspiring about somebody like that. I mean, Lee is a hero. He's my hero, and I'm full of hope because of people like Lee and people who are working on this issue and other issues.
And Jennifer, what's your biggest concern, and how can we support you in overcoming that?
I would say that I don't want there to be a kind of blip with this film that everybody is outraged for a short period of time and then everything goes back to normal. And I suppose I don't want to be naive by saying that films can change the world. I do think they can. But they change the world with the help of a whole bunch of other people who are using it as a tool. So my hope is that it continues to be used as a tool, and that we, whatever we can do as a tool, and collaborate with people who are using it as a tool to affect real change and to put a spotlight on these chemicals and the way that we've used them. I want that to happen. So my fear is that doesn't happen. We're screening for European Parliament. We're opening in the US in sort of mid-year. We're really trying to put pressure on the ministries of health, environment, and agriculture here in Canada. And that's what we have to keep doing. So the more that people can help us do that, and when there's another action to be taken, we'll share it with you and hope that you do. But in the meantime, just for people to be aware, active, and articulate about their opposition to these chemicals, and I think is the most important.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. And, I just want to wrap by saying that is one of the things I appreciated deeply about Into the Weeds is it felt like a conversation. It felt like people coming to the table with genuine curiosity and wonder and open hearts about, like, is this real? Like, is glyphosate really having this impact? And if it is, then what can we do differently? And if it is, how can we hold our governments accountable? How can we create change for ourselves individually and collectively worldwide? So I have such deep appreciation for the way that the creative choices that you made, and for the way you shared the story around glyphosate and the impact that it's having on our earth and its biodiversity and on human health, and not just the human health, but like the microbes and the animals and everything we share this earth with.
Well, remember that everybody can watch this on CBC Gem, so it's there, and it's available. So if you haven't seen it, please watch it. Go to our website. If you want to send us a note, please do. If you have some ideas about having a community screening, we're still doing that. All of those things are still possible. So thank you.
That is, yeah, that's awesome. And beyond Gem, CBC Gem, do you know where else it might be released, or do we just follow you on?
All of the website, as it
Okay.
goes into different places, it's still playing in festivals around the world. And as I said, the US release is happening. So there will be ways to see it, but for now, that's the best place for Canadians to watch.
Yeah, it's awesome. Go watch it. It's brilliant. It opens hearts and opens eyes. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your advocacy. And thank you for sharing your heart with us today and just sharing a small part of your work and journey. Appreciate you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Take care.
Go find and follow Into the Weeds on the web, intotheweedsimpact.com, and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. They are Into the Weeds. So I'm curious, what are you going to do next? Is that picking up the phone or writing a letter to your MP? Or are you going to watch the documentary Into the Weeds? Or are you going to do your own research to find out what you can learn about glyphosate personally? Or are you going to pick up the phone and have a conversation with one of your friends or family about glyphosate and what you can do to make a difference? We're deeply honored you tune into Heart and Soil. Thank you so much for joining us, and know that the work you are doing is super important and we appreciate you. And big love. You make yourself an amazing day.